Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am a survivor of Bob Jones University. And this is Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism, which is a podcast that sheds light on Christian fundamentalism in the context of Bob Jones University. The show includes survivor stories from BJU and also Bob Jones affiliated ministries like Christian day schools, camps, and churches. The podcast also explores BJU's influence beyond the school and its impact on American society. I want to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to do this work, and if you could join my Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of every episode. But if you feel that you can't do that, then I would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Pledger, and I am excited for you to hear today's episode. Daisy came back on the podcast because she had more experiences and memories that came up that she wanted to share. So she digs into more memories from her time at Bob Jones University and also at the Wilds Christian camp, and just sharing the manipulation, the religious indoctrination, just the brutal physical activity, and also predatory behavior that she experienced from an authority figure at the camp. Something I am happy to share with Daisy's permission is that she officially got diagnosed with autism. And I'm really, really happy for her, because getting an official diagnosis is so validating. So I'm happy for her that she was able to get that. But enjoy this episode. I had a delight talking with Daisy again, and I hope you enjoy this episode of Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. I am really happy to have Daisy back on the show. They had a lot more things that they really wanted to share that really they remembered, and they've been writing out a document of all these different experiences, and I wanted to give them the space to really go through it and share these experiences. But thank you so much, Daisy, for coming back on the podcast.
For having me back. I'm glad to be able to do this again and complete the rest of my journey.
Yes, yes, and I'm really excited to hear that. And so that's why I want to give you the space of like wherever you wanted to start with sharing your experiences.
Sure. Well, firstly, I have written out a document of all of my memories so that I can just read through it, because of there being so much. And a lot of these things that I've written down, well, all of them are memories that were suddenly unlocked after years of being locked away. And I wanted to make sure that I documented them so that I wouldn't forget them again. But first, I would like to read my note at the beginning, which is: human memory is a fragile thing. Our experiences in life can be molded and changed by circumstances surrounding the events as they happen to us. All of these experiences that I recount in this statement happened to me during times of extreme duress, trauma, and stress. Due to this, some of my memories may not be fully accurate to how other people may remember them, especially some of the reconstructed conversations which took place at the time. These memories of mine have been unlocked recently after having been locked away deep in the chasms of my brain for nearly 20 years, and have only just been revealed to me in recent weeks. So while dates, time frames, and some conversations may not be 100% accurate in my memory, I can attest with complete certainty that these situations with these people did in fact happen as I recall them. These events are facts and are in no part fiction nor slander. They are my recollections as best as I can recall them after 20 years of having blocked them out of my experiences from Bob Jones University and the Wilds camp. They are not written in chronological order, as I have been remembering these events sporadically. I share them now to raise awareness of the abusive environments, situations, and people in these institutions, in the hopes that no more children, teens, or young adults will be victimized in the name of God by these abusive entities. I solemnly attest that these statements are the whole truth as I remember them.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that because it is hard to come forward as a survivor because people will nitpick you over every little thing. Even if there's one little thing that's off, it's like that very black and white approach. Oh, you're lying. Oh, you're this, you're this. Um, and and sadly, like memory is something that is weaponized against survivors a lot. Um, and like, oh, I've had my own mother do that to me, where like, oh, well, human memory is not perfect, so she has this black and white view of, oh, then it's not right at all, and it's very dismissive and validating. So thank you for saying that. But yeah, I want you to start wherever you would like to start.
In the early 2000s, when I was in my early teen years, for some reason, my parents made me sit and listen to the Bob Jones University Chapel Hour every single day for a very extended period of time. I can't remember why I was made to do this, nor for how long it lasted, but I do clearly remember sitting at the computer, listening to Bob Jones University Chapel Hour sermons that had been downloaded to the hard drive with great difficulty. These were the days before Wi-Fi, and our access to the infant internet was via a dial-up connection. Yes, I'm that old. When I look back on it, I think there is a good chance this had been used in place of a devotional hour because I found it easier to absorb information if I listened to it, and my parents wanted me to be fully indoctrinated in the IFB ideology and decided this was the best way to do it at the time. I don't know what their thought process was, but what I do remember was that chapel hour was truly agonizing for me. The sermons were full of harmful rhetoric, and the speaker screamed a lot, which I did not enjoy at all. I did hear some preachers that I enjoyed periodically, but it wasn't because of the message that they were teaching. It was because they didn't shout. At this point, Ian Paisley comes to mind as a preacher that I didn't hate listening to. He didn't shout, as far as I recall, and he had an Irish accent, an accent I always enjoyed hearing, and still do to this day, though not because of Ian Paisley. I just love Ireland and Irish people. This was a few years before I was sent to the wilds, and between the ages of 13 and 16, my parents were waging war against, quote, worldliness, unquote, that they saw cropping up within me. I had discovered secular music when I was 12, and I was caught listening to it just over a year later, and my radio was confiscated. From that point on, whenever we went to a restaurant, my father would demand that the wait staff turn the radio down because my daughter has a music problem. Some of them actually did as he demanded, which is frightening to me now because I realized that at that time made me feel as though my father had absolute power and control, which made me feel more powerless and small. During this period, my salvation was constantly questioned. Every single thing I did, my parents deemed sinful. And the more I sinned, the more my parents told me they were convinced I was unsaved and that I needed to get saved. So I got saved over and over again, every single day, every single hour. Every moment I heard a murmur of disapproval, I'd think, oop, lost my salvation again. I'd better pray and fix that right now, because any moment I could die and go to hell as a punishment for being bad. I must have repeated this ritual 1,000 times in the space of the month when we were visiting my grandparents, and I was constantly getting in trouble for everything. I was barely 14, and I was so confused and afraid. I cried myself to sleep every night, and I felt despicable. In 2008, when I had only been at Bob Jones University for a few short weeks, and I had just been put on the cleaning crew for Rodehaver Auditorium as my on-campus job in the work program, one of the first red flags that lit the match, which would eventually ignite the dynamite and create the big explosion of trauma that quickly occurred for me while I was there, was that I had just gotten off either my first or second shift. I was walking back to my dorm room, and I was on the phone with my mom as I walked back because she had asked me to call her every night after work to make sure I was getting safely back to my dorm. As I was speaking with her, a strange and angry female voice called out, "Hey, who are you talking to?" out of the darkness. I told my mom to hang on and called out, "Who's there?" the woman came out. I don't remember who it was, if it was a work supervisor, a teacher, or what. I can't remember their face or their identity. But what I do remember is being angrily told that students weren't allowed to use their phones coming back from the work program, and that I would be reported for breaking the rules effective immediately. And she demanded my name and dorm room and insisted that things would be worse for me if I didn't immediately give her the information. I was scared, so I gave her my room and my name. I was trying to explain that I was a brand new student, and no one had ever informed me of this rule, and her insistence to report me was unjust because how can I prevent myself from breaking a rule I didn't even know existed? She walked off in a huff and was gone before I could say anything. I was called to the disciplinary committee a short time later and was then given the chance to explain myself. I was not given demerits for it on the proviso that I be sure never to break the rule again, which of course I never did. In addition to this incident, while I was on the working program, my supervisor while I was on cleaning crew was a woman. I can't actually remember her name, but for story purposes, let's call her Heather. Heather, for some reason, dressed like she was from an Amish community. I don't know anything about her origins, so I can't say whether or not she actually was Amish. But all I know for sure is that she definitely stood out, which seemed to please her immensely. She had it out for me from day one, and our rivalry began over the most foolish thing you could possibly imagine. I was constantly getting in trouble with her for putting toilet paper rolls with the pull piece up top, what I call the A position, in the roll dispensers in the ladies' rooms when we cleaned them. I put them that way because that's how I was trained to change toilet paper at home. When I first met Heather, the first thing she ever said was that she was a bit of a stickler for certain things, and that made the students dislike her, but she didn't care that no one liked her. All she cared about was having things done her way with no questions asked. She did tell me when changing the toilet paper rolls to put it in the B position because that is how she liked it. People I knew who used the restroom, myself included, always complained about the paper being put in that way. It was harder to access through the paper dispenser and always cut off before you could finish unrolling a large chunk in your hand to clean up with. I got to a point where I realized that Heather was putting the paper into the dispensers in the B position deliberately because it made it so that people were aware she had been there that week. People inevitably always complained about the TP situation in that bathroom, unless Heather was away and I hadn't been thwarted in my efforts to make the paper come out the right way. Her need to be the burr in every woman's saddle who used that bathroom was not a good enough reason, I felt, to make everyone miserable when using the restroom. So I continued to put the rolls into the dispensers in the A position. This just served to increase Heather's abject hatred for me. She soon began making things difficult for me at every twist and turn, at one point becoming verbally abusive and screaming at the top of her lungs at me for not changing over the toilet paper the way that she liked it to be. Finally, after months of being tormented by this insane, petty woman, I requested to be transferred out of the cleaning crew and was subsequently placed in dishwash in the dining common. Dishwash was everyone's favorite job on campus, except for me. I hated it. It was smelly, slimy, sweaty, messy, grimy, and a literal sensory nightmare. It was freezing cold at all times back there, for one. For another thing, people would literally throw their trays onto the conveyor belt, and bits of food and drink would splatter up into the faces of the workers who had to put the trays under the power washer. Then the power washer would spray up in our faces, and the water was either scalding hot or freezing cold. There was never any happy medium. We would be covered in rubber gloves and rubber aprons and hairnets to keep our hair out of our faces so we could easily work. But there was nothing easy about it. And Boges were inevitably always our supervisors, or at least they were always inevitably my supervisors. I've blocked out a lot of dishwash. It was my own personal hell, much like the rest of Bob Jones was. But this was especially awful for me because of the sensory overload that immediately hit me every time I worked a shift. The shift also invariably made me late for certain classes, which of course got me in trouble with the teachers. And as I was always endlessly bullied by my teachers anyway, this was just an additional stressor for me. The only thing about dishwash that I remember very clearly, besides how awful it smelled and the sensory overload that came with it, was what I think may have been my very last shift working back there. It had been an exceedingly awful day. I had gotten demerits for missing room jobs that morning because I had overslept, and almost was late for class. I hadn't showered that morning because I hadn't had time to do so. My teachers in class that day had been abusive, and here I was in dishwash having trays thrown in my face. I was at the front end of the wash line that day, and every single student who came through for a good 20 minutes was throwing their trays on the conveyor belt. And I was getting pelted with leftover bits of beverage dregs, cold bits of half eaten food, and having hot and cold water sprayed in my face repeatedly the entire time. Finally, a male student came and threw his tray so hard onto the belt that an entire glass of milk that had been undrunk and was at room temperature flew into my face and got in my eyes and mouth. That did it. Sensory overload took over and a meltdown went into effect. Everything seemed to slow down around me. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands were shaking. My ears were ringing. My arms went numb and my whole body went cold. Before I knew what was happening, I screamed out the window, "Stop flinging your trays onto the belt!" And I got in trouble. I have no memory of how much time elapsed. It may have been a few days later, but if memory serves me correctly, this outburst was deemed large enough for me to be sent to the Dean of Women's office to discuss the incident. I was subsequently removed from the workers program, and I had a black mark on my record for the remainder of my time as a student. I believe this is what also led to me being sent to see Jim Berg, who eventually assigned me a biblical counselor because the school felt that I was too angry. I understand now that what happened must have been an autistic meltdown. I had already been overwhelmed that day, and it may have reached burnout point. The discomfort of dishwash being unhelpful enough, but I had no way of knowing that at that time. I was officially flunked out of Bob Jones in May of 2010, and my black mark that I obtained from the school followed me home and remained a permanent blemish on my character in the eyes of my family. It still marks me in their eyes as a failure, an embarrassment, and the black sheep of the family to this day. I remember almost nothing from this time period in my life except for one fleeting memory which was recently unlocked. During the first few months of my time back home, there was a period where we visited relatives in South Carolina. It was during that time that I was presented with Jim Berg's horrible devotional book, changed into his image, and was forced to use it as my daily devotional workbook. If memory serves me correctly, my parents made me fill out each devotional daily, and I had to let them read what I had written so that they could check that my, quote, spiritual life was improving after my sin of flunking out of BJU. The way the book is laid out, the reader cannot answer the questions correctly unless they are the most self-loathing, derogatory, self-hating answers that the book prompts one to believe of oneself. The basic premise of the entire book is to convince the reader that they are nothing better than disgusting, slimy worms that God absolutely cannot stand, who has to jump through the most perilous flaming hoops in order to regain favor with God, chief of which admitting that they are disgusting, slimy, hateful worms. That was a mindset that I had had to verbalize during my biblical counseling sessions when I was black marked as a student at BJU. The brainwashing went deep, and it took over 15 years for me to unlearn all of the indoctrination and finally come to love myself.
Oh, how are you feeling?
Winded.
Oh, wow.
That was a cluster. I won't use the additional word for the safety of the ears listening,
Yeah.
but that was definitely a difficult time period, and it was a time period in my life where things like that were happening on a constant daily basis without a break. Just trauma after trauma after trauma over and over again on repeat. And I'm amazed that I was still functioning by the time I got to Bob Jones. I definitely wasn't when I left. Bob Jones was the catalyst that finally broke me. But yeah, and that there's so much more in between that time period that when I go back and I look at it, I'm just like, man, how was I existing? Like, how did I do it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's just so heartbreaking just how you were just broken down at every turn, every way possible, and how you will not get approval unless you believe you're so awful. And it's so tragic. It's very abusive teachings. And I'm glad you're here. and you're exposing it because it's so normalized in that culture. Like I remember out of curiosity looking at Jim Burke's reviews for his book Change into His Image and just people saying like, oh, this is so great, this is amazing. And I'm just like, oh, all these people are so indoctrinated. And it is something that's interesting to me because fundamentalists, something I'm still trying to understand, they're very contradictory.
Looking at the purity culture standards should give you your answer right there. It's sex is great, don't have it. As a woman, there's all of these lines that you have to abide by. You have to dress attractively, but not too attractively because you don't want to cause a man to stumble. Your clothes have to look a certain way, but they can't be trendy. They have to be trendy within the IFB community. You can't have your hair too short. You can't have your hair too long. You can't have your hair too straight. You can't have your hair too curly. You have to wear makeup, but you should never wear too much. And it's just it's like that line in the Barbie movie, where we're told we're too loud. We have to sit down and be quiet. We should always be happy, even if things are going wrong. And it's just this constant back and forth. And that never ends. And they do the same thing with every other aspect of their belief system.
Yeah.
God is merciful, but he's also jealous and vengeful. God is good, but he also has this side that, if you make him mad, you're in big trouble. And, it's just like, which way is it? Can you
Yeah.
one, please?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because in cults, Robert J. Lipton talks about demand for purity. That's one of his criteria for thought reform. Holding people to impossible expectations is one of the key parts of cults because you're never enough, you can never do enough, you're told you're not enough, and there's constant striving for these standards. And like there can be this high that comes from when you finally do for a little bit meet their standards, but then when you fall down, there's so much shame. And it is a way to control people because no one can be perfect. And at Bob Jones, you're basically told that you can reach that state of perfection. They just justify it through sanctification. And looking back, and really, as I interviewed Dr. Camille Lewis, when you're out of it and you start questioning it, I'm like, now, why wasn't the emphasis loving and caring for the people, feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, reaching out to the community? But no, you had us so focused on how awful we were and how we needed to reach this state of perfection to be acceptable.
While keeping us exhausted, making sure that we never had enough food, and making sure that we never had enough sleep, doing all of these things that are known torture tactics, you know, and it's just like the tireder we were, the hungrier we were, the sicker we were, the easier we were to control. So they thought, some of us, it didn't work that way. Me, I kept fighting, because that's just in my nature. And I've always had to fight every single day of my life just to survive in my own body. When you have chronic illnesses and all these things that are, I realize now, a result of the trauma that I was experiencing, but I didn't know that at the time. you know, it was nothing new for me to be exhausted all the time, hungry all the time, because at that time I was starving myself because I was trying to fit into their beauty standard, which was impossible for me to fit into because my body's not built like that. Little did I know. And it's just all of these things. You're When you come to a point that you realize that you're never good enough, by that time generally you've already been through hell and back, and it's too late for you to really do anything to prevent any further damage. Really, it certainly was for me. I mean, this environment has been something that I have known on a daily basis for 30 plus years of my life. You don't recover from that quickly.
No, no, you do not. Oh my gosh. And yeah, I mean, it is, yeah, brainwashing cult tactics to break people down, control them, make them into this person that they want. And it's just, and it's something that I've talked to other people before, is I'm really curious about the suicide rate of people who've been involved in fundamentalism in general, but also at Bob Jones. That's something I've been really curious about.
Well, I didn't hear about it too much when I was there. Um, I've heard some stories about suicide within the community since, most recently being the child of a faculty member.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's so sad and heartbreaking. What else would you like to share that you have written down?
This is my memory from when I was at the Wilds camp. I think this is the last one that I have to share. My friend and I were sent to the Wilds camp, and we absolutely hated it. They forced us to play very active and aggressive games in 95-degree weather with 100% humidity 4 times a day. These games were bookended daily by 4 chapel sessions. We'd get up in the morning when the bell rang at 6 a.m., be in the mess hall for breakfast by 7, and be playing games with giant beach balls where we had to run around like crazy for hours on end before being sent in to shower and dress for the chapel service, and then be sent back to change again to play another game before lunch, and then 2 afternoon games and services. The games were brutal and violent. I was medically unable to run at the time due to having asthma. The Wilds team members forced me to run anyway. Other kids with severe medical issues were also forced to play the games, and no one was allowed to sit out. I remember one time in particular, I had gotten my period and I was still forced to play the games. I had tried to explain to the camp counselors that I had my period and I was in extreme pain. I didn't know at the time that I had polycystic ovarian syndrome, which made my periods excruciatingly painful and affected my ability to be active. But they didn't care and told me I had to play. No excuses. On this particular day, the heat was soaring up past 100 degrees with an equal level of humidity. I was in so much pain, I was bleeding heavily from my menstrual cycle, and I was short of breath because of my asthma, the humid conditions, heat, and forced activity. I soon got dizzy and nearly passed out again because of the unbearable pain, heat, and lack of oxygen. All I remember was hitting my knees mid game and not being able to stand up. My friend tried to help me. A counselor on the sidelines came bounding over, angrily demanded I get up and play, and I almost got in trouble for sitting there unable to move. I finally was able to breathlessly explain that I needed to see the nurse. In the nurse's station, I was giving water and an ibuprofen and told I could sit out the rest of that specific game, which was the last game before the next chapel service, but that I would have to participate in the remaining games for the rest of the day. I was finally able to sit out at least one more game after superficially twisting my ankle during another go at the giant beach ball. I hated that accursed vessel of hot air so much. Many of the campers were seriously injured, sustaining broken limbs that day, and only the campers with broken legs or arms were allowed to sit out the games for good. I knew we were in trouble when I actually envied the campers with broken limbs. The only thing we had to look forward to during our stay there, I believe we were there for 2 weeks, though I'm not completely positive about that timeline, was meal times. The food was carb heavy, fried, completely void of nutritional value, and addictively flavorful, and we were allowed to eat all that we wanted, which was a welcome treat after all the enforced exercise because we were starving all day, every day. Bedtimes were monitored. Every camper, every cabin had a cabin supervisor, of course, a Bob Jones University college student, who usually held dorm supervisory positions on the BJU campus. One of the many things that was highly controlled at the Wilds was bedtimes. Even though they operated on keeping us exhausted as a form of control, if we weren't asleep by 9 p.m. at the bell and the lights out, we would be reported to the higher ups and we got in trouble. Though I can't say I know what happened to kids who flouted bedtimes because I wasn't one of them. God help you if you were an insomniac, but the fact that they kept us moving for 12 hours a day, every day, with almost no rest in between violent exertion and chapel services, made falling asleep immediately a lot easier than under normal circumstances. Rand Hummel was in charge, and he was very predatory. He seemed to be fond of campers who asked him for advice, perhaps because it stroked his ego. He presented himself as being kind and trustworthy to those campers, including myself, who, for some odd reason, trusted him with information he never should have been privy to because he could not be trusted at all. I made the mistake of asking to speak with him on a number of occasions, asking for advice on how to deal with my abusive parents in a, quote, godly and respectful manner. Oh, how naive I was. This was information I felt I could trust him with, because he had written a very convincing book on the dangers of explosive anger. At that time, my father had a terrifying temper. He could lash out within a split second, with no warning beforehand. Something as simple as dropping a cup with liquid inside would elicit a violent meltdown of rage, and that rage frightened me. I decided that Rand Hummel was someone I could talk to about my concerns due to his having written his book, but he soon proved himself to be untrustworthy as he was. My questions to him as to how I could deal with the untenable situation at home in a godly and respectful manner were answered by my being told by Hummel that in order to be respectful, I was not to deal with the situation at all, because to be a godly woman, I couldn't stand up for myself, as it was considered ungodly and demonic to do so. Sure, my parents were strict, but they weren't abusive when they disciplined me, because discipline was of God, and it was my duty as their child to accept the discipline with thankfulness and silence, because silence was not only respectful, but also godly. This rubbish was fed to me like chocolate off a plate, and sadly, I bought it, hook, line, and sinker. I thanked Hummel for his good advice and actually left the counseling shack with a spring in my step. I felt wonderful. I was so relieved to know that I wasn't being abused, that it was really all in my head, and that in order to have a better life at home, I just had to obey better. I didn't know then that I had just been gaslit into blind submission again. It had not been the first time. I was a trained people pleaser, and I had been broken very early in my life. We were always to take everything an authority figure said to us and never question it, but blindly obey everything they told us. That was bad enough, but it would only get worse. Not only had Hummel gaslit and manipulated me, Hummel had ratted on me. Instead of actually trying to help me, he called my parents and informed them of my confidences. I was made to dearly pay for attempting to get help when I returned home from the camp. Another thing that stands out to me about Hummel that I now find absolutely terrifying was his purity culture teachings. At the time, I felt left out, that I was nearly 18 years old and had never had a boyfriend. Literally all of the other girls in my age bracket were already dating, and some were engaged. It was very unusual in the IFB culture for a young girl of 18 to be single and not looking forward to being married before she was 20. I was made in my circle to feel ashamed of this, and in order to make myself fit in with my peers, I invented an imaginary boyfriend. I chose an actor who had died several years before, because people forget actors that haven't been seen in more than a few years as a general rule, and I felt safer using him as my imaginary paramour. This actor had only been 12 years older than me, but something I didn't realize, being raised in purity culture background, was that that was actually an inappropriate age difference. If that actor hadn't have died 3 years prior to that time, he would have been 30 years old. You do the math. Well, one day I was brought in to talk to Rand Hummel about my home life. This was after he had already gotten me in trouble. My parents had called the night before and said that I was going to speak with him the next day, and that I would be speaking with them when I got home. And while nothing was said by them, I knew I was in deep trouble. When Hummel brought me in and began asking me questions about my home life, I non-answered them as much as possible. And then I was asked the question I feared most. Did I have a boyfriend or any type of relationship at all? I later learned that this question had been fed to Hummel to discern if maybe I was acting out because of a boy. This shocked me when I learned of it, because I never ever left the house except to go to church or to my friend's house. And I never went to any of these places without my parents' knowledge or permission. And I never snuck out because I had no reason to, and I was too scared to. But the fact that my parents actually thought I was seeing someone in secret was very confusing to me. For some reason, though, after the question had been asked, I decided that my life depended on answering in the affirmative. And I told him that yes, I did have a boyfriend who was 12 years older than me. and that because he was older than me, he was waiting for me to turn 20 before we got engaged. If this wasn't proof that I watched too many messed up romance movies as a teenager, I don't know what is. Purity culture absolutely did not help my already very warped sense of what romance looked like or should have been. So I made up this whole elaborate story about how this imaginary, wonderful paramour of mine would come and rescue me and drive me away from my abusive home life, and we would go to the mall or a library, lots of safe public places together. I made sure to include that because Hummel had preached a chapel sermon the night before about how if you're daring to date, courting was godlier, make sure it's a very public place so you won't be tempted to sexual sin while being out with each other in public. I expanded to say that these public places were where he would make me forget all of the awfulness at home by keeping me company and treating me like a human being for a few hours before reluctantly returning me to my parents at the end of the day. When Hummel asked if my parents knew about him, I said no, and please don't tell them about him. They would force me to break up with him, and I would never have another boyfriend, and I would just die. He then went on his purity culture tirade and asked if I had ever had him in the house alone with me. I said yes, but that he had never tried to do anything inappropriate because he was a good Christian man who knew better. Hummel's response was to toothlessly smile, gesture a point in my direction, and reply, dangerous, casually, still with that smile on his face. Never at any point did he seem to have any problem with the fact that I was claiming to be having a relationship, a romantic relationship, with a 30-year-old man, and I wasn't quite 18. All he was concerned about was I remaining pure with this man? Eventually, it all came out that I had not been honest, which, of course, I got in even further trouble for when I got home. But nobody had ever been concerned by the truth that I was in an abusive home and needed help getting out, which added to the fantasy romance with the non existent man of my dreams at that time. All they cared about was lording control over me and all of the other kids who were campers there. All they cared about was their games and keeping us tired, hungry, and exhausted so they could remove our ability to judge for ourselves while gaslighting and manipulating us from a pulpit 4 times a day for 2 weeks. It was mind numbing. Since my time there, more disturbing things about the wilds have been exposed, and I am very curious to hear the rest of the survivors' stories. Mine is fragmented, as I ended up blocking out a good deal of what happened to me and my friend during that period. What I do remember is traumatic enough on its own, but I wonder if I could remember every single aspect of that trip, how much, if not all of it, would be equally damaging and traumatic as the memories I didn't block out.
Ooh, wow. Wow. Hmm.
It still stands out to me to this day. The fact that even though I was lying about it because I wanted to fit in, I was talking about having a romantic relationship with a 30-year-old man as an 18-year-old. No red flags went off? Why? Can someone please explain that to me? All they
Yeah.
were worried about was, were you remaining pure? Seriously? Seriously. The mind reels.
Yeah. Yeah.
Their obsession with sex, disturbing enough. The fact that they don't seem to be concerned at all about children being molested, which happens constantly, and I mean absolutely constantly in this environment. The way that they play pedophile shuffle, which they're very adept at, I might add.
Yeah.
Who's not aware of that? Just watch Let Us Pray on HBO, and that's Prey, not Pray. It's just I have no words. I can't.
Yeah. It's like you had said before we recorded, it's like you're shocked, but you're not also at the same time.
Yeah, their opinions of women and children are despicable. We are viewed as property, something that should be seen and not heard, something that can be owned by a man, and something that can be controlled by a man. I can't even verbalize the the sickness of it all. Like I don't even have words for it anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm tired of it.
Mm.
I had an experience recently with a family member. I found out that they were preparing to go to Bob Jones University. This family member is female, and she's quite young, younger than I was when I was at Bob Jones. And I put myself in danger, and I went and I told her there was still time to back out. And I explained as much as I could in that situation, of what was potentially waiting for her if she still went, namely abuse and heartache. And her answer was, okay, well, I'm sorry that you feel this way, but don't forget about God. And my heart just dropped into my toes. I remember sending you a 10-minute message of me just sobbing my eyes out immediately afterwards and just feeling like, so helpless and defeated. I kept saying to her, you don't want to end up like me. You have a choice. People are telling you you don't, but you do. There's still time to keep yourself safe. And it just rolled off her back like a duck with water. I mean, you know, that scared me to death. I know that my family has drunk the Kool-Aid. I'm not really surprised, but knowing the pain and heartache that is waiting for her, it's like a knife to the heart for me. And I don't know what her future is going to be like if she goes through with going. I don't know what's going to happen to her. All I can do is hope by some miracle, and you know me, I don't believe in God or miracles anymore. But if by some miracle Bob Jones closes its doors before she gets there, I think that's the only salvation she could potentially have from being harmed at this point. And that infuriates me.
Yeah. It's just the pain of seeing family members still so indoctrinated into that system. And it is so hard to really understand what's happening to you because if something's going wrong in your life, you're blamed and you're shamed. It's never the system. You're always like blaming yourself, gaslighting yourself, putting yourself down. And it takes a lot. And I hope that maybe you planting that seed will maybe help her question and maybe go somewhere else or not go to Bob Jones. Um, but yeah, it's hard to watch when you've been through horrible things and you see someone going in that situation and you're like, no, I don't want you to go through that. Like, please stop, please don't. And like you said, I remember you talking about how in your first interview that, all the people in your church are basically all family, all went to Bob Jones, affiliated with Bob Jones. And it's the only way. I remember Aaron Birchwell saying in the religion news article about how like Bob Jones just infiltrates families and they see it as the only way. And it's heartbreaking.
Well, that's the way it is in fundamentalism too. You don't join fundamentalism, you're born into it. That's
Oh
the way
yeah,
it all
you are
works.
born into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, the family culture that they thrive on so much is done by design, because they know that without being born into it, that they won't have converts. And that is the only way that they can have any form of survival as a cult. And I think a lot of cults operate that way, religious cults at least. I don't know about um other cults, obviously, but you know, cults like this, like fundamentalism, um, Amish Mennonite, they are family based, and it's very rare to hear about people just joining them as an adult. You usually hear generation, 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 generation over and over and over again.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
Well, I think that's all that my memory has the capability of dredging out at this time.
Well, I thank you for being willing to come back on and share it because it's not easy. And it helps other survivors know that they're not alone. And a lot of BJU loyalists try to silence us and say, oh, it's just a few people. But as more and more people come forward, it's going to be a lot harder for them to say that.
I think if I were to have a Linda Listen moment, like they say on Cults of Consciousness, it would be don't let them silence you. You have a voice, you have a mind of your own, you are an entity unto yourself, and you have the right to have control over your own autonomy. You're not a robot. Don't let them convince you you are.
Yeah, it's very powerful. But thank you again so much for coming on today and sharing more of your experiences. I'm glad we could do it.